Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to episode 16 of the ESG Show. Today, we're discussing human rights and the supply chain. But before we get into that, let me just tell you about a tweet. An X I spotted this morning. It says, new record high, the US solar power generation output was up to more than 20%, from July 2022 and nearly 125% from July 2019. That's a doubling in about 4 years. And in fact, if you take another look at the graph, that's a doubling from 2015 to 2018. So it's doubled twice, which to my way of thinking, isn't that what they call exponential? When something keeps doubling, that's exponential. The IEA, the Institute of Energy, the International Energy Agency, has been consistently underestimating the wind and solar rollout time and time again since around about the year 2000. As you may know, an energy expert called Hoekstra has created a chart demonstrating this. I believe, here's the chart, and it just shows how every year from, I think that's from around about 2000, it makes its projections, and they're just hopelessly wrong. And I believe that the mistake that the IEA keeps making is to extrapolate recent trends arithmetically rather than exponentially. To think arithmetically when things change exponentially is a common mistake, but it's why I remain optimistic that we can get CO2 emissions down to near zero by the middle of this century. Anyway, the theme for today is human rights in the supply chain. These days, there's a greater understanding of the importance of a detailed understanding of the supply chain, not just your suppliers, but the suppliers' suppliers and so on. And there is an understanding for the need for resilience. It kind of reminds me of something that Nassim Taleb once said. Nassim Taleb, as you may know, is the author of The Black Swan, a very influential book written, it's been about 20 years ago now. And incidentally, he's also a critic of ESG. Enough of that, but that's a story for another day. But Taleb once said, nature likes to over-insure itself. Layers of redundancy are the central risk management property of natural systems. We humans have 2 kidneys. This may even include accountants, he says. Extra spare parts and extra capacity in many ways, many things, say lungs, neural system, arterial apparatus, while humans' design tends to be spare and inversely redundant, so to speak. We have a historical track record of engaging in debt, which is the opposite of redundancy. And he draws an analogy with the human kidney, which has always made me laugh. He says that if the human body was designed by economists, we'd probably have 1 kidney to share between about 12 people. And the supply chain, I think there's a good analogy here with the supply chain, because the supply chain needs redundancy and it needs resilience. It needs excess capacity, just as we have 2 kidneys, where usually 1 will suffice. And to do this, it means you need to know the supply chain inside out. And what has that got to do with human rights? Well, a supply chain that sees human rights abuses is not resilient. Public backlash or government regulation could have a devastating impact on your business. Now, I'm not saying we should only worry about human rights in the supply chain because we want a resilient business. I like to think that we're all sort of decent human beings then, and in which case human rights should concern us all. And that means treating all international conventions on human rights as sacred, by the way. Any attempt to move away from such conventions, in my view, is playing with fire. Indeed, history tells us that ordinary people who one assumes are quite decent can ignore all kinds of human rights atrocities if it suits them. This is one of the things that puzzles me about the backlash against ESG, of claims that ESG is woke. Is worrying about human rights in your supply chain really woke? Really? Or is it emphasis or is emphasis on this progress? Is emphasis on human rights in the supply chain progress and an attempt to create a more enlightened world? That's how I would see it. I much prefer the phrase enlightened capitalism to woke capitalism, and isn't objecting to enlightened capitalism the kind of things that, say, the villain in a Bond movie might do. Anyway, that's enough from me. Let's introduce today's guests. And joining us today is Arjun. Hello, Arjun.
Hi, Michael.
How are you? I was about to say your surname, and I think I'm going to let you say that because I know I'm going to mess it up.
Arjun Ahluwalia.
Good to have you here, Arjun. So Arjun is a legal and compliance expert with 2 decades of experience working in compliance, financial crime, and human rights. He has worked as an advocate, consultant, and in banking and energy. He's passionate about human rights and ethics in supply chains and international trade. So Arjun, you've got 2 decades working in compliance, financial crime, and human rights. So does anything stand out in your mind? Have you got sort of any anecdotes that you could relate to us?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think for as far as we've come, and really a lot of work in financial crime and compliance has been going on since the 80s and 90s. But for as far as we've come, we've still got a long way to go. And today's discussion is a really interesting one because for me, I feel like we are on the right path. And we can see that most recently with the crisis in Ukraine, where you can see that a company's desire to do the right thing is powered as much by its people as a faceless corporate strategy. So that really does give me quite a lot of optimism. But I think the real challenge now is the how. How do we get there? How do we do things in the right way? And how do we bring something that seems so ethereal into a practical, commercial, manageable process? So for me, there is a long way that we've come, but it's now time to learn those lessons and take them forward.
So it's time to stop talking and start doing, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Arjun. Also joining us today is Steve Hyland. Hello, Steve. How are you?
Good morning, Michael. Nice to see you.
Steve is a professor. Sorry, can you just go on mute for a moment, Steve? Steve is a professor of history at Wingate University and a senior consultant at Responsible Alpha, an ESG integration consultancy and signatory of the Net Zero Financial Services Providers Alliance. He works at the nexus of academic research and practical applications of ESG and sustainability frameworks in pursuit of a low carbon, equitable and sustainable world. So Steve, as a history professor and ESG consultant, tell me, are there any lessons from history that apply to ESG?
Thanks, Michael. I think it's an important question. There's 2 things that immediately come to mind. One is the transition will produce unexpected outcomes. I think of the system of transatlantic slavery in the 19th century. As that began to wind down, we saw in its place in this transitional moment before labor migration really kicks off in the second half of the 19th century was the emergence of indentured servitude, which brought hundreds of thousands of Chinese and subcontinent Indian labor to the Caribbean and parts of the Americas. And the second one is that there will be stranded assets. The most famous one from the 19th century is the whaling industry, which was used for its oil for lighting. But once gas began to replace it, all those assets went to the wayside in a very, very fast manner. So it's stuff that's often unexpected. And so we'll have to be highly attuned as we accelerate the transition over the next coming decades.
Thank you for that, Steve. And also joining us today on the show is Edyta Kosnik.
Hello.
Hi there. How are you?
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Good to be here.
So Edyta is a marketing leader specializing in Saas, software as a service, tech, and services within ESG and risk compliance space. As a sustainability and ESG marketing advisor, she consults marketeers and businesses on how to best build their GTM strategy in order to grow their ESG and sustainability products and services to become trusted long-term partners to their customers. ESG Investing certified, Edyta is a passionate advocate of all things ESG, including today's topic, human rights and governance within global supply chain. So, Edyta, why is it you're so passionate about ESG?
Always been, always took interest in environmental, social issues, inequalities. It's been stated that
Edyta, I think we've lost you there.
yeah, I think.
Are you back?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. As you were, please continue.
Yes. All the beautiful uninterrupted seasons and capitalism, which was not yet so brutal. Nonetheless, there were issues, and now I think we are at the most advanced stage as a species. We, with our intelligence, with our knowledge and technology, and in our current climate, the geopolitical situation, the climate warming, we need to make this world, this environment safer and stable for everyone. And I think this can only be done with long-lasting, sustainable vision and with governance in place. Now, we can argue that ESG, with the ESG as long as we want, really. There are different opinions everywhere, which we're going to be talking about. But clearly, whether we want it or not, it's just not going anywhere. And I support very much all the tech and the services within ESG. And I do understand how mammoth job it is now to try to embed into the fabric of businesses and society. We are on the good track, as it's been said already. But hope is part of my mission to help to cut through the noise.
Thank you for that. Okay, and we're talking to Edyta again in a few minutes about a report that she wrote about anti-slavery and the supply chain. Normally, when we do the ESG show, we review a couple of news stories. Well, today we're only going to be reviewing the one story, but it just so happens that we have the author of that story with us today. Steve, welcome back. So you wrote a piece, Navigating the Storm, an examination of anti-ESG rhetoric and the path forward. So Steve, you started your piece looking at the history of ESG, or to be precise, what we've been doing going back to the 18th century. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate, firstly, the read and also the opportunity to discuss it further. I think there have always been concerned citizens or communities that worried about the outcomes of capitalist practices. And oftentimes in the Americas, these were religious or faith communities. And so you have the Quakers at the end of the 19th century or in the end of the 18th century. And over the course of the 18th century, you did have some Quakers who participated in the trafficking of humans. But there was a collective decision that they needed to be removed from it. In the 19th century, we see evangelists such as John Wesleyan, but it's also in the 1840s where the Roman Catholic Church coins the term social justice. By the end of the 19th century, you get Rerum Novarum, which was an attempt by the church to make a moral case for the immoral outcomes of the Industrial Revolution. So oftentimes these were minoritarian groups or minority groups that over time would carry the day to certain degrees, right? It was never perfect. But so, yeah, there's a long historical arc of people trying to address the worst outcomes of capitalist practices.
Okay. So we're saying that the Quakers were an early pioneer of ESG then?
I would say so. I mean, obviously we're using a contemporary term, a term that's 20 years old and plastering it back onto historical practices. But yeah, I think you can draw connections over time, which is the job of a historian, right?
Indeed. And so why do you think ESG is so controversial?
I think it's controversial for a couple of things. One, it is kind of clunky when you're combining environmental concerns with social outcomes or social impact of business operations, and also having a say increasingly by investors in how companies run themselves. There's a German political scientist by the name of Benjamin Brown who refers to this as asset manager capitalism. He's a young guy, or younger than me anyway. So it's about intervening in the operations of a business. Secondly, those who have benefited most from the current setup, right, have vested interests in either slowing the transition, because the transition is coming, or trying to stall it in its entirety. And then third, it just it has been mapped onto other social disagreements, in particular here in the United States, where I'm based. And so it has become a cudgel to yell or engage critically other social movements that are going on.
I like the description, asset manager capitalism. I've not heard that before. I definitely want to try and remember that and use it again in the future. So you often hear a lot of criticism of things like critical race theory or the rights of transgender people. And then that's described as woke, and then in the same breath, and ESG is woke. But have those things got anything to do with it, right or wrong? And I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong or not. I don't want to get into that conversation. Has that got anything to do with ESG?
No, in the main, but perhaps, you know, having a greater concern about your workforce, right? If you have a number of employees or that are transgendered or from the LGBTQ plus community, and you want to put in policies that help develop human capital for this subset of your workforce, then it can be tied into it. Critical race theory comes out of the academic universe. What critical race theory, for those who are unfamiliar with it, it was a way to take independent variables such as class, social class, and gender or race, and see how they intertwine, right? How do they interact and how it produces certain outcomes within a given society, right? So it's very much an academic exercise, but as you know, for those who watch either the United States from afar or who live in the United States now, that race is such a complicated social issue in this country, political issue as well, and economic issue as well, that for those who are opposed to this sort of progress, it becomes a cudgel that can be used because, you know, it's easy to remember CRT. If you ask a lot of people what CRT means, they probably can't tell you that it means critical race theory. So you have CRT, ESG, it rhymes, right? And it becomes easy for those opponents of more sustainable and equitable outcomes of a capitalist system. It allows them to use and abuse these terms with reckless abandon.
I'll be honest, Steve, I was desperately trying to think of a third acronym to rhyme with CRT and ESG, but I'm afraid I failed. But that was a really nice description of critical race theory there. I like that. You know, I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so what can the ESG community do in response? I believe you kind of outlined 3 different approaches here.
Yeah, so in the article that my colleague Travis Knoll and I wrote, we said there's 3 possible ways to push forward. One is the moral dimension, right? Embrace what ESG wants to achieve from a moral perspective and then attach it to a political movement. We don't think that's very viable because we don't think that's a majority representation of those who are interested in using or applying ESG ideas and metrics to achieve a sort of just transition in this particular historical moment. The second one is to remove the second path forward is to remove the moral dimension and just focus on voluntary disclosures, like Bob Eccles has advocated in parts. I mean, I'm flattening his suggestions. Another one would be from what Professor Alex Edmonds has argued, is that you take ESG off of its pedestal and you put it side by side with other more established criteria that help evaluate long-term value creation, such as, other intangibles, such as, brand recognition, employee satisfaction, patent applications, and the like. For Travis and I, we find that just to be, we find that to be unsatisfactory. So we argue that the third option is to combine the moral with the disclosures, or, aligning or putting ESG next to these other ones, because it allows those who support what ESG is attempting to do to tell what we're for, as opposed to playing defense against people who define what they are against.
Okay, thank you for that, Steve. And please join us again in a few minutes when we talk some more about human rights. Also joining us today is Edyta. And Edyta recently wrote a report, The State of Modern Slavery, Human Rights and the Supply Chain. So Edyta, how big a problem is this?
Well, it's substantial, to say the least. ILO estimates that out of 50 million in poverty, people living in poverty, about 28 million are in forced labor.
Sorry, how many in forced labor?
About 28 million.
28 million. Okay.
Yeah. So that's that's a huge problem. The problem is that international businesses, business transactions are dominated by multinational enterprises, and then subs and affiliates are established where it makes sense for the multinationals. As a part of a global factory supported by contracted suppliers and non-contracted suppliers of suppliers, which makes it a huge web, which is very difficult to control, basically. So bringing those two networks together, it is estimated that about 80% of global trade is directly and indirectly related to global value chain, which is orchestrated by multinationals. So this has a consequence on how the global network operates, how they develop and spread the code of conduct and the legal compliance. Now, modern slavery was introduced about 2007, and today it's an umbrella term to describe various forms of severe relational exploitations in the workplace, at home, and elsewhere. That includes ranges of practices defined in law in the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2015, and by reference in Australian Modern Slavery Act with 2018. That includes child labor, human trafficking, forced labor. There are examples of workplace practices associated with unskilled or low-skilled labor, which is also constitutes of modern slavery. And that's because those workers are accept any employment they can find. They are very, these practices are also often related to migrant workers, which are vulnerable. They've got language barriers. They are not aware of their rights.
Okay. And what about modern slavery laws, or where do we stand with that at the moment?
So, everyone agrees that that we have nations to have a fundamental duty to protect their workers. A strong legal framework is really critical for administering and enforcing labor justice. But in reality, some countries' jurisdictions are more conscientious than others in providing the regulations and the structure to protect. Some of them are doing this through lowering or hiring the reporting thresholds, imposing civil penalties for companies which are failing to comply with mandatory reporting. Some of them requiring the implementation of a due diligence system, which is good because the German Due Diligence Supply Chain Act or European directive, which is coming, are actually making this compulsory to do the due diligence throughout the Supply Chain Act. So, and it's going to be through tier 1, 2, and 3. And actually, the European directive is going to go through as long as doing due diligence on the customers. So that should help immensely. However, you know, reporting of modern slavery risks or incidents and also complaints and grievances is also required. And this is one of the this is a part of coming regulations as well. You know, it's all about risk and it's all about managing those risks.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm going to be talking to Arjun again in a few minutes anyway, and then I'm going to be talking to you all sort of in general about this topic. But before we move on, I just wondered, Steve and Arjun, if you have any sort of comments to make about what Edyta has been talking about modern slavery in the supply chain.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? The term modern slavery, I often feel, is unhelpful. Because typically people have a fixed view, and I think, Stephen, you sort of gave an interesting perspective on this when you're talking about CRT, that people have a fixed view about the term, about the word, and the idea that the mere concept of what slavery might entail. Actually, the way it's often termed, and a lot of companies may be surprised to realize they actually may do more on this than they thought, because a lot of the discussion is actually captured in worker welfare. Forced labor is often the term that is perhaps a better descriptor of the practices that we're looking at. And also, if you have an international supply chain, you may find that your compliance with the right kinds of laws and regulations is happening in a way that you didn't necessarily realize, because you're capturing employment rights. And a lot of this is actually considered in pockets of organizations that don't necessarily speak to one another. Or particularly between suppliers. So it's not all doom and gloom necessarily. There may be more that a company is doing than it realizes. But I think one thing that we really need to tackle head on is the terminology in some respects, because actually a lot of the times people shy away from the idea that they are involved in activity that has to do with modern slavery. But in fact, if you talk about it from labor practices, or really just get into the detail of what is happening when we start. I think that's where corporate sustainability and supply chain transparency actually go further to capture the issue than the term modern slavery. That's certainly my view.
Okay, and Steve, any comments to make on that?
Yeah, I think so. I've tried to write about this with another colleague about a year and a half ago, and this is a vexing issue. And so I'm grateful that Edyta and Arjun, you know, have dealt with this for quite some time, because from an investor standpoint, right, it's really hard to police how big firms make decisions on their supply chain. You can have a human rights policy published on your website, and you can have an anti-human slavery or modern day slavery policy, but you know, supply chains, international supply chains, are so complex that how does a firm police it, and what obligation do they have outside of the regulatory disclosures? And because I would imagine many of these supply chains operate in societies that are less committed to SDGs and democratic values and the like, and so the discussion needs to be had. But for me, it's such a challenge to wrap my head around it, you know, as an intellectual, but also as an investor, about how to police it and how to gauge it and look at positive change over time. Because the average investor probably doesn't know about, doesn't think about these sort of forced labor practices until they hear that, you know, a clothing factory in Bangladesh has collapsed because of poor construction.
Okay. And Edyta, have you got anything else to add before we move on?
I think the one thing is I agree completely with the fact that it's so difficult to kind of do the due diligence and police it. I think that's where technology comes in as well, although still very much not perfect. That's why, you know, the technology providers, the service providers are scratching their heads and thinking like, how can we penetrate the supply chain, the global supply chain to tier 2, tier 3, and suppliers of suppliers, you know, the family which is doing something for the supplier, etc., etc. So I think no one have it sorted completely yet. Well, whoever is going to have that problem nailed, you know, there are companies which are helping and providing enhanced due diligence. So they are penetrating the issue manually, contacting the suppliers of suppliers, producing the questionnaires, etc. It's a long job, but it's worth having, I think, because in the long term, that investment, you know, that investment can pay off definitely. It brings back much good than worse.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm now just going to have a brief discussion with Arjun. So I'll just say goodbye to Steve and Edyta for a few minutes. So Arjun, how do we tackle the idea of human rights in the supply chain in a commercial environment? Why would or should a company care?
I think it's an interesting question, Michael, because there are a number of reasons why a company ought to care. And I sort of alluded to this point earlier, that companies increasingly are made up of a lot more than a singular corporate mindset. They're very much driven by their people, whether they're the employees or the suppliers, customers, etc. So there's already a lot of push-pull on factors on a company defining its approach. But I think the way we can break it down easiest is in sort of 3 different ways. So there's a practical, ethical, and a regulatory reason why a company ought to care about the mindfulness of human rights in the supply chain. The practical one is very much driven by the realities behind correct labor practices. There are increasingly a number of, and I'll use the term loosely on this one, but ESG clauses in contracts. There are very much a number of contractual requirements to comply with international conventions and human rights practices. So there's the legal aspect in that sense, but very much also baked into the idea around having more transparent supply chain. Ultimately, the more compliant, I guess, your supply chain is with human rights practices, the more resilient it's likely to be. If you think about the kinds of places which will have untoward human rights practices, they're unlikely to be representative of a safe or stable business environment. And I think that very much in a cold, practical sense should drive the reasons by which you'd want to have a resilient, ethical supply chain. I think that brings us on to the second point, the ethics behind it. Ultimately, ethics, it's a term more often used in the non-financial services capacity to describe good practices. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think the ethics behind business activity is starting to become a lot more prominent. We saw that with the international response to the crisis in Ukraine and how that's been driven as much by the employees within companies as it has by the external factors. And then I think the other key piece here being the regulatory side. And the regulatory side is taking an interesting perspective from both a carrot and stick point of view. Historically, the regulatory mindset has often been to fine or bring enforcement actions on companies that don't operate in the way that they're looking for. But increasingly, we're seeing in a very much international trade context, the way in which actually having a ethical supply chain and ethical practices can bring you commercial value. The best example is in the US, that to obtain preferential importer status, you need to show that you comply with a social compliance program. So there's a number of different reasons for which having attention to this is quite key. And I think the important piece to try and get companies to care is to present the entire spectrum of reasons why, because they will touch on different aspects within the management structure.
Okay, and are some industries more at risk than others, do you think?
I absolutely think that's the case. I think often when we think of modern slavery and forced labor, we tend to think of fast fashion. It's the one that you can sort of most easily point to as, you know, I think there's been some high profile examples of where things have gone wrong. One of the key highlighted issues by the US in relation to forced labor in the supply chain in China and in the Xinjiang province has been to focus on cotton. And you can see where that arises. But actually, I think the commodities sector is actually a lot more at risk. So whether you talk about oil and gas, whether we're talking about key commodities like copper, lithium, cobalt, etc., those commodities, particularly in the energy space, typically come from countries which are less likely to practice the higher standards of human rights as defined by international conventions. They're often going to be places where you might see instability in the government, you might see high prevalence of corruption, and you need only look at the Transparency Index and Transparency International's reports on that to see what that looks like. So I certainly think some industries are very much more at risk than others. And in particular, we might feel as consumers more comfortable in being discerning on our choices on purchases for clothes and fashion labels. We find it a lot more difficult to do that in relation to being discerning in the purchases of energy. It's just the nature of that particular market and the way in which the commodities that are extracted come into market and come to consumers. So I think that's certainly where the biggest challenges lie.
Okay, and so what can we do about it? Well, what is needed then to create sort of like a more resilient, human rights conscious supply chain, do you think?
Well, I think there are a number of different factors here. I think industry standards really do play a big part, and industries have an interesting capacity to self-regulate. We've seen that in the oil and gas space in particular, likewise with fertilizer and agricultural products. You can see where you can drive practices using things like international sanctions. We've seen that on the movement of Iranian and Russian oil as an example. But actually, the more that industries take a stance on their own to say, whether or not the law requires us to not trade in a particular product, we are going to adopt our own standards and take a view that we will choose not to do that, and then to implement that into their global supply chain. So I think big global companies have a big part to play on that and setting their own standards. But I alluded to it earlier, I think the demands from consumers are absolutely critical. Now, I think when I say consumers, I mean that even to the extent of saying businesses as consumers. So if a business is demanding of its suppliers and its supply chain before it gets to its next manufacturing phase that we need responsibly sourced copper, we need good practices in mining activity, for example, we want to see compliant practices in the components that make up the technological practices. Then before, for example, an Apple consumer buys its iPhone, each part of the manufacturing process, which is phenomenally complex and incredibly interesting, needs to have its own demands on that supply chain as well. And then I think finally, this may feel a bit more controversial, I think capitalism is has its part to play in this. And I think from the financial sector, in particular insurance, there needs to be more demands on that supply chain, that the willingness to withdraw finance opportunities or to place a levy on those finance options to force companies to adopt the right standards. And I think that push-pull factor is going to be absolutely critical.
Okay, and I've got one more question. If you could answer it fairly quickly, and I'll also, maybe Edyta and Steve might want to come in as well, which is when things get tough, do you see these issues are getting sidelined?
I think they can be if the practice hasn't been embedded into a company's mindset. But actually, once that's the case, no. I think if you look at environmental factors, once we saw the cost of oil and gas rising, you saw the reintroduction of the use of coal and even wood to power stations, etc. I don't think that's so much the case in the human rights space. My concern is that it's more likely that companies will deprioritize or sideline as appropriate projects to implement transformation. But I do think once those controls are in place, once policies and standards are set internally within companies, within industries, no, I don't see that being something they're prepared to row back on. And I think you can see that particularly in the health and safety space. So once health and safety standards were set by companies as to what standards they wanted to comply with, they embed and then become something they're unlikely to row back from.
Okay, thank you for that. So I've got a question. Excuse me, my voice disappears. I've got a question from Alan Langston, who's a regular viewer of the show, and he says, "Do you think we will or see the equivalent of greenwashing in human rights?" It's a question for all of you, really, but I'll fire it at you first, Arjun.
Absolutely. I think the term needs to, so greenwashing has already become an extremely complicated and quite charged term, but misstatements and misleading descriptions of practices, absolutely. I mean, we can see in fast fashion, descriptions of sustainable clothing options, and often that will carry a premium on the price. But we need to see transparency on that. And yes, I absolutely think we will and are seeing that, and I think the appropriate term of social washing probably is where we need to go to see that companies are holding true to what they say they're doing. So it is definitely one to watch from both consumers and regulators.
Because that's two terms I've learned today so far: asset manager capitalism and social washing. Those are two things I'm going to have to try and remember. Stephen and Edyta, have you any observations either on Alan's question about greenwashing, social washing, or indeed on what Arjun has said so far?
Well, just a quick observation from me. I mean, I think, of course, it can happen, and I think it can happen whether consciously or subconsciously, because companies making those statements might not even know that they are actually not compliant because of the problem with the due diligence within the global supply chains. Hence why even more important things to take responsibility for the chain, for the due diligence, for the reporting, and making sure that we take responsibility, the companies are taking responsibility for what's on their websites, basically. But yeah, very much so.
And I think it is part of the complication of looking at greenwashing in human rights is how expansive the view of human rights is. For instance, the bank Raiffeisen Bank, which is an Austrian bank, they earn about 30 to 40% of their annual profits from their operations in Russia, right? And so and they have a human rights policy. So I guess it depends on how narrow or how broad we apply the idea of human rights to a business's operations, where regulation comes in, where investor sentiment is. And so it is, to a certain degree, I have some sympathy towards these multinational firms because it is a complex landscape they're operating in.
Okay, Massimo says monitoring procurement for ESG requisites is challenging but essential. Billions of euros by European taxpayers are poured into European Union funded projects like green steel. We cannot accept unethical behaviors violating human rights by suppliers just for money saving procurement at lowest cost without checking and control. Comments on that? Anyone? Any observations?
So
I think basically you agree, don't you?
Yeah, I agree. I'm with Massimo in spirit, for sure. I keep coming back to, as I've tried to puzzle through this is a remarkable challenge for a lot of firms, especially in uneven regulatory landscapes and as well as cultural formations across time and space. I wish I had a better answer other than I agree.
Fair enough. Arjun, were you about to say something there?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult challenge, really, because particularly in the current setup, I do think, also when I say setup, the current environment is one where taxpayers are demanding lower costs. The prices do get set at a higher premium, and the argument here is that in order to have an ethical supply chain, you will pay more. And actually, if you take some of the steps that I referred to and that are out there, you actually can flip that and say, actually, you'll pay less. Because if there is a premium applied to unethical practices, whether that be by regulators, whether that be by actually a self-imposed requirements, then what you start to find is that supply chain becomes cheaper the more transparent it is. So if you take the idea behind illicit commodities, the cost of compliance drives up the difficulty in establishing those particular supply chains. And you start to find that it's cheaper to go buy products or commodities which are sourced from more ethical places, even though it may appear that at first glance they're cheaper. So there is a way of flipping that round, but it means taking some of the steps that we've described earlier.
Okay, thank you for that. Edyta, have you got anything to add at all so far?
Yeah, I think we just need to make sure that all the costs which are involved in making it more resilient and more transparent are going to be taken off those which are further down the line, suppliers and sub-suppliers, which are usually at the raw stage of manufacturing. That's where the modern slavery usually happens the most. Because they are the ones which are, the smallest and just trying to cope, trying to make the ends meet, and often, and they won't be able to afford any expensive due diligence processes, which are sometimes, the bigger companies are trying to kind of put the burden of the costs, or at least some of the costs of the due diligence, on them. So I don't think that would work. I think we have to find a way of making sure that the burden is taken off from those raw suppliers and move it towards where the money is, be more within the supply chain.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Are we a little bit? Do you think we're all a little bit hypocrites? I mean, I buy cheap t-shirts. I go out and there's a certain retailer in the UK, and if you live in the UK, you know the retailer I'm talking about. And you go in there and you pick up a t-shirt for almost nothing. And I'm sure there are many things that we do. We buy products in which somewhere down the supply chain there are abuses of human rights. And actually we think about it, we know that they're there. So, are we all not slightly to blame?
I think one thing to bear in mind is, in the discussion, I think this is true of all aspects of ESG, is that the concept of hypocrisy is incredibly unhelpful. The world is far more complex than the binary idea that if you do X, something Y will happen, and that's the end of it. To give you an idea, we've seen in Europe in particular a real concern about the movement of footballers into from the Premier League in the UK to Saudi Arabia. And the flip side of it as well, there are a number of other problems that you can see taking place in the UK. So are we not hypocritical to engage with it at all? And I think the answer to that is no. The discussion is what matters. The demand is what matters. And I think the point that I've been trying to make has been actually that the demands made by consumers the choices made by consumers, and all along the supply chain that will apply to suppliers as well, to their suppliers. That's what will actually change the dial. It's not the purchase of a pair of cheaper shorts that you need to take on holiday that will undermine the debate, but it's the overall shift in the debate, the desire to buy green steel, greener power products, ethically sourced clothing. That will shift things over time. I think individual scenarios don't change the overall. It's the overall movement that will matter.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we've just got 2 questions, and we've really just got enough time to deal with these 2 questions. And even then, we're going to deal with them very, very quickly. So I'm going to ask for a yes or no answer. Nanish Gupta, who should pay for the increase in costs, customers or shareholders? Edyta, can you answer that in one word, or do you need more than one word to answer that question?
I think we should encourage shareholders to pay for it, and then customers are going to be very happy to pay for the premium. But we need to be educating the society and the businesses about the real progress.
Performance. Thank you. Steve?
I'm going to punt both.
Okay, fair enough. And Arjun?
Agreed, both.
Okay. And Eric V, I don't know. I think Eric V is probably the Eric who's going to be talking on the ESG show later this year. I have a painful ethical problem with child labour. I'm, of course, against it. Everybody is. They should obviously be either studying or playing still. Because I worked for decades all around the planet, I know that they should not work. They would not if they did not work, they would probably die from starvation. Their parents might. Parents are also slaves, modern slaves. So it's a bit of a problem, isn't it? You know, what do you think?
There are some interesting responses to this. I'm mindful of time because I think you could really delve into that as a show on its own in some ways. There are some interesting studies, in particular focusing on countries in the Far East like Thailand, Cambodia, etc., where those ethical dilemmas are really, really challenging. I don't think there's a simple one-word answer to that question. I think that, again, that comes down to a requirement to demand better supply chain and more ethical supply chains, complying with an international standard. I think that's really ultimately what will drive a lot of change, because some of that, in the same way that regulations, etc., may demand certain things of companies, countries will then be driven to say, well, this is impacting our economy. We really need to start tackling this.
Okay, thank you. We've got 2 more questions, and I really think we're going to have to give them 30-second answers. And I'll throw them, one at you, Steve, and one at you, Edyta. Pablo, what is the panel's view on the moral ambiguities that could arise, i.e. exiting a market or supplier which uses child labour? A scenario could arise where those child workers could be forced into a worse position. I think that's quite similar to the last question in a way. Does the panel think that the due consideration has been given to such unwarranted outcomes? Edyta, Steve, either of you.
Yeah, well, I think we're coming into the situation that it's not just a supply chain issue. This is overlapping with the economy, with politics, with the overall situation in the world, and just the supply chain is not gonna just legislations for the supply chain is not gonna solve it, because there is a reason why there is a hunger in the world, why we have something called Third World War, and you know it's complicated.
Indeed. And then finally, I think I'm just going to read the question. I don't think we can have enough time to answer. Dr. Anne-Marie Sidhu said, you mentioned the cost of compliance driving up the cost of less transparent supply chains. But the reality is some countries rely extensively on cheap labour for manufacturing, construction, etc. The cheap labour is usually migrant labour where many of these issues occur. The issues are complex. The food chain, for example, is a good example. Do people buy from their local farmers, which is more expensive, or would they prefer to buy the cheaper products imported from South America? I suppose that kind of ties in with my question earlier about hypocrisy. You know, we don't want slavery in the supply chain, but if the product's cheaper, then we kind of go with it. Look, guys, thank you very, very much for your time today. It's been really, really interesting. Just wanted to say, I think it was Arjun, you made the point about football players in Saudi Arabia. All I wanted to say about that is, isn't Messi playing well in America at the moment? And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this week. The ESG show is a weekly show, but there are 3 weeks a year we have off, 1 in August, 2 at Christmas time. Next week is a week we're having off. And the following week, our theme is going, the first Wednesday in September, our theme is the African perspective on ESG. And the following Wednesday, we're looking at leadership in ESG. So thank you, Arjun, Edyta, and Steve. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you all in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.